Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of Senator Mike Gabbard, on behalf of Senator, why is it echoing? This forum. I'm Meg.
Pardon, we can't hear.
Conference. Huge mahalo to the Hawai'i State Capitol for graciously sharing their wonderful auditorium with us today. And special thanks to Darnell, who is helping with last minute technical issues. That wasn't part of my script. I just added that. Thank you, Darnell. This morning, we will hear from Dan Galpern on climate change and the rule of law, and Mike Ewall on the dangers of incineration to our health and environment. And they will be offering time after the presentation for everyone to ask questions. So, Mr. Galpern, Dan, right here in the front row, he'll be coming up in just a minute. He's an environmental and climate attorney and policy analyst from Eugene, Oregon. Since 2011, Dan has served as legal and policy advisor to climate scientist James E. Hansen, including with respect to administrative, criminal, and civil state and federal actions in the following states: California, Iowa, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, Washington, D.C., Colombia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Uganda, and the United Kingdom. So that's quite a litany of places. And we're very happy to have him with us. He's the author of Climate Change 101, Urgency and Response, and also author of Atmospheric Recovery Litigation, Making the Fossil Fuel Industry Pay to Restore a Viable Climate System. And our second speaker today will be Mike Ewall, and he is a national expert as well on energy and waste issues, with a focus on waste incineration, its hazards, and alternatives. And he's here all the way from Philadelphia. He supports communities to transition from polluting energy and waste facilities to clean energy and zero waste systems. Since the early 1900s, his work has directly led to the defeat of dozens of proposed waste incinerators and other noxious and unnecessary industrial facilities. His research has documented that waste incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. It's dirtier than burning coal and worse than using landfills without burning first. In 2003, he developed the Zero Waste Hierarchy that was the basis for the Zero Waste International Alliance standard. And without further ado, let's all welcome Dan Galpern.
Thank you very much, Meg, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and wish to especially thank a number of people and entities, including, of course, Darnell, the legislature's Environmental Caucus, the Environmental Caucus of the Democratic Party, the Hawaii Climate and Environmental Coalition, Meg Turner, of course, of Senator Gabbard's office, Elise from Representative Lowen's office, Melody Aduja, and Dave and Sherry Molnix. As you are all no doubt well aware, I'll also be sharing my PowerPoint. Let's see here. So let me go to that now. As you're no doubt well aware, too well aware, the nation is now caught in two major crises, at least. First, the crisis of democracy, and the second, the climate crisis. Our crisis of democracy arises primarily because of the MAGA movement, as we could call it, an essentially authoritarian movement, and its fundamental disrespect for the rule of law. Now, adherence to the rule of law has governed or conditioned our fundamental duties to our nation since its founding, often honored in the breach, but still. And this is true even, or perhaps especially, for principled activists who on important occasions, when pressed to the limit, have indeed peacefully engaged in civil disobedience in order to bring attention to instances or patterns of lawlessness that is a failure to live up to the ideals of our constitutional republic. And in making this point, I'm well aware, indeed, I'm necessarily pointing out that the present threat to the rule of law goes well beyond the acts of our twice impeached and 4 times indicted ex-president. It's true, criminal defendant Trump has pursued the lawless manner and method of tyrants in his quest to weaken our major institutions, retain power in the face of the will of the electorate, and now to try to avoid legal accountability for his depredations against our democracy. But defendant Trump, it needs to be said, was aided and abetted every step of the way in its attempted coup by a veritable raft of co-conspirators. Here's my collage of co-conspirators, who actually I borrowed this from a paper. All of whom knew better. We all could name at least a few of them. I'll do so here. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, Jeffrey Clark, John Eastman, Kenneth Chesebro, Ray Smith, and Robert Cheney. Of course, all of them are now indicted or under investigation for being co-conspirators. They all share that in common. They all share something else in common. Can anyone say what that might be? To the lasting shame of my profession, they're all American-trained lawyers. Food for thought. Well, now at long last, it appears that the wheel of justice may be turning. But the question is whether it will turn fast enough. And at least to my mind, the truly crazy thing about all this is that even in the face of the mountains of evidence that this criminal conspiracy led by Trump and in support of Trump to defraud the public and steal the 2020 presidential election, the truly crazy thing is that he still remains the front runner for the 2024 Republican nomination by a wide margin. So about that, one specific thought at least comes to my mind. And I think probably for most people who continue to respect the rule of law, equal justice under the law, and the fundamental principles undergirding our constitutional democracy. And that is, there ought to be a law. What kind of law? Well, I think one that expressly prevents any insurrectionist from running for president, or for that matter, running for any other important government office. And in fact, amazingly, there is such a law. This is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War. And so it's a part of our Constitution, the law of the land. And it provides that any person having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution is barred from any office, civil or military, if they engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the government, or if they've given aid or comfort to the enemies of the government. It's plain as day. In fact, so plain that two highly conservative scholars, legal scholars, major members of the Federalist Society indeed, saw fit to point this out in a forthcoming law review article from the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, where they said that the language of these provisions of the 14th should be read in as straightforward and common sense a manner as possible. And again, I'll add, because this is the clear instruction of the United States Constitution, it is the law of the land. But again, whether this constitutional instruction will be enforced really is the critical question, as Justice William Brennan would have pointed out were he still alive. All right, turning then to the climate crisis. This too, that is the resolution, at least from the vantage point of the United States, this too is a matter, I think, in substantial part of enforcement of the law, that is, enforcement of existing law. But that relevant law is not broadly understood, even though it's plain as day for the reading, as you will see. In the face of climate-induced or exacerbated drought, wildfire, sea level rise, superstorms, and the certainty of far worse to come unless we get our act together, a number of activists and groups are reasonably decrying our federal government's seemingly split personality on climate. The following slides are my photos from the recent major climate march in New York City, which I attended less than 2 weeks ago. So, to that split personality of US policy. On the one hand, our federal government continues to permit, or otherwise not to challenge, for example, with respect to the Line 5 pipeline owned by Enbridge, cutting across Minnesota and Wisconsin on its way to Ontario, moving incredible quantities of crude oil through highly sensitive regions and the homelands of indigenous people. And otherwise not to challenge such projects, a number of which are exceptionally hazardous. On the other hand, we need, in fairness to note, the Biden team did succeed in passing the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Indeed, they got it passed with no Republican votes in the US Senate, 0. And so it passed by the mathematically narrowest possible margin, 51-50, with the vice president casting the deciding vote. But clearly, the IRA is not enough. True, it provides some substantial taxpayer subsidies for research and development in clean energy, as well as for carbon removal. And many of these subsidies will further enrich, however, the major fossil fuel interests that already have laughed it up all the way to the bank by their ability to continue to treat the atmosphere as a free and open sewer for greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly it's not enough. Indeed, the IRA does not compel or straightforwardly induce the shuttering of a single coal-fired power plant or a single natural gas plant or any oil refinery. And neither does it halt the flow of United States produced oil or gas or coal into the international market. And so many activists, as I said before, understandably, and I think wisely, have called upon President Biden to declare a national climate emergency and then to use that declaration to suspend existing law allowing the export of oil and gas or allowing oil and gas drilling in the outer continental shelf and so on. Now, on the face of it, is there good reason for the president to declare a climate emergency? Well, I think, of course there is. For one thing, we are in a climate emergency. And so such a declaration would demonstrate that the president is truly awake, as called for by the sign, "Wake Up," is truly awake to the problem. So there's that in favor of such action. It would show also that he is listening, and I say he and his administration are listening to the science. This is a biologist. And such a declaration would unmistakably raise expectation for more climate action. And you may recall, some of you, if you are following things in Washington, D.C. closely, that during the last State of the Union, Biden was heckled by MAGA Republicans for several reasons, but one of them, perhaps the loudest booing and heckling, occurred when he very timidly noted that we need to, at some point, phase out fossil fuels. This is a fact. If we intend to preserve a planet to which we are accustomed, one that is not too hot to allow humanity to continue to flourish, particularly in parts of the nations around the equator. Declaring a national climate emergency then would show his willingness to stand up to the MAGA hecklers in Congress and elsewhere. And yet, of course, well, not of course, but as you may know, the president has already rejected such calls. And the rationale he gave is that he's already effectively declared a climate emergency. That's false. His very strong executive order right after the inauguration in 2021 did call for an all-of-government approach to address the existential, as he put it, problem of climate change. And that was important. But he hasn't declared a climate emergency, and he hasn't attempted to undertake some of the far-reaching actions that activists have called for, and which I agree are necessary in some way. And I think that he's likely rejected the calls to declare a climate emergency for the reason that he's been advised, probably correctly, that doing so and taking actions pursuant to such a declaration would lead to it being overturned in court. Indeed, this seems to be the view of a number of legal scholars. For instance, Professor Dan Farber of the University of California, Berkeley, who's perhaps most known in the public eye for the founding and running of Legal Planet website. He's argued, again, I think regrettably, probably correctly, that within hours of any such action, pursuant to a climate emergency declaration, a Trump-appointed judge would issue a temporary restraining order and to be followed by a permanent injunction against such action, and that would be upheld by higher courts. Again, is that possibly correct? Well, regrettably, I think it might be. And so let's take a look at some of the details. This is the underlying, statute governing the potential suspension of exports of oil produced in the United States. And as you can see here, Congress has clearly spoken on this. Even with a national emergency declaration, not because of climate change, but for any reason, the president is able to impose export licensing requirements or other restrictions on the export of crude oil for a period of not more than 1 year. So not especially useful for dealing with a long-term crisis. Or for example, let's take a look at the statute underlying to which some people, some activists and some organizations have pointed to say that with an emergency declaration, the president could simply suspend oil and gas operations from public lands that have been leased to producers. But look at the bottom. The law is quite clear that that doing so, even in the event of a declaration of national emergency, could only be done if the US government would also pay the fair market value to the holders of those leases for the suspension of those oil and gas operations. So it's essentially, it would mean that we could suspend the operations, but at the cost that the US government, that is the taxpayers, would be buying out all those leases at fair market value. Not a reasonable option. And then, of course, and this is implicit in my brief review of these statutes that are governing these potential actions, a number of independent activists here, a co-director of the Brennan Center, have noted, have argued, convincingly, I think, that such emergency powers as are potentially conveyed by the National Emergency Act, or there's a provision of the Defense Act that would allow such as well. These were never meant to provide long-term solutions to persistent problems, such as climate change. And beyond these legal points, I think there's a straightforward political one. And we need to attend to the major political conditions here. Because consider that the Biden Justice Department is now fully engaged, at long last, but they are now fully engaged in the effort to reinstate the rule of law in this country against the MAGA depredations, their injuries to our democracy, to at last hold people accountable for violating the law. So in this context, to undertake a substantial suspension of federal law governing such a major industry as the fossil fuel industry, that likely would be seen to undermine the fundamental democracy restoration project in which the Biden administration is necessarily engaged. So at least tentatively here, I need to conclude that unless these underlying major statutes were changed, the mere declaration of a climate emergency does not seem to be a good path forward to doing what is necessary. Well, what is necessary, just as the throngs of people 2 Sundays ago called for, we need to end fossil fuels. And I would say, as a friendly amendment, we need to have an orderly phase out of fossil fuels. In this nation, first and foremost, because we're most responsible for our climate crisis, and then hopefully to be emulated by all other nations. Of course, we're not the leader in this regard, but we should push as quickly as possible if the right thing has anything to do with what we will do going forward. And so, in light of the continuing political impasse, preventing any new substantial action by a still divided Congress, what can be done to compel the phase out of fossil fuels? A phase out that would, at the same time, make polluters pay. And that would protect public health. Well, as it turns out, there is a straightforward path, one that could build on a climate emergency declaration or even proceed without it, but I think it would be easier to proceed with such a declaration by the president. And to explain that, I need to first lay out some other law, but this requires getting into the weeds a little bit. And to do that is sometimes a little difficult. So I thought I would put up a pretty picture that of a photo that I took my first day here of sunrise in Oahu. But before getting into the statute, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act, to provide a preview, I need to say something about the climate cycle, the carbon cycle. This seems in balance, actually, showing CO2 rising from a number of sources, including a power plant, and then being taken up by Earth's systems through weathering and then deposit into the deep oceans or into the Earth's crust. There is a carbon cycle, and it ensures that at least a small portion of the atmosphere contains CO2. And in fact, if that were not the case, Earth would be a frozen ball of ice. We need some CO2 in the atmosphere. How much? About 350 parts per million or less in order to maintain our Goldilocks state of a planet. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. And it's been that Goldilocks state that over the last over the last 20,000 years has allowed civilization to develop. But now we're far outside that range. In fact, we're already up to 417 parts per million, as this next slide shows. And in fact, that atmospheric concentration rise has been especially steep since 1992. And that's important, actually, because it was that year that the nations gathered in Rio to sign the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, committing publicly to ensuring against any dangerous anthropogenic interference with our climate system. But nonetheless, the nations of the world have continued to burn fossil fuels and inject additional CO2 into the atmosphere at a very high, and I would say entirely unsustainable rate, and thus our present climate crisis. All right, to this statute. And this will amaze you if you are not familiar with, for example, with our petition from last year, where we pointed this out to the administration. And we did that petition under Section 21 of the Toxic Substance Control Act, and don't need to know the numbers here, but that provides citizens with the right to petition for rulemaking, specifically under the Toxic Substance Control Act, and specifically under Section 6 of the Toxic Substance Control Act, this section. I've provided some portions of that here. And it says that if the administrator determines that the manufacturer, I'll come back to that, the manufacture, processing, distribution, and commerce, use, or disposal of a chemical substance or mixture, coal, oil, gas, they're all chemical substances or mixtures listed in the TSCA toxics inventory, or the byproducts of combustion, for example, CO2 and methane, and some of the other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, but principally CO2 and methane. If that or any combination of any of these activities presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, then the administrator shall, not may, but shall by rule, apply one or more of the following requirements to that substance or mixture to the extent necessary so that the chemical substance or mixture no longer presents such risk. You keep going until you solve the problem. What problem? The problem that is creating the unreasonable risk. And importantly, I said I'll come back to this. What is manufacture with respect to coal, oil, and gas? Well, TSCA defines what manufacture means. Although, like many definitions in TSCA, it's not perfectly happy. They define manufacture to include manufacture. So, see, that's not very helpful. But also production and importation. So, putting it together, if the administrator, the head of EPA, determines that a chemical substance or mixture, such as we have here, such as we're under consideration here, if the production or importation or the processing or the distribution and commerce or the use or the disposal of these chemical substances or mixtures, if they create an unreasonable risk, then EPA must act and impose one or more of 7 specific requirements, which I'll talk about 2 of them in a second. And it must be done, not may be done. The most important such requirement, in my view, is the first delineated in TSCA Section 6. And that is a requirement restricting to the point of prohibition the manufacture, again, manufacturing includes production or importation, processing or distribution and commerce or of such substance or mixture. So there it is. This is one of the requirements that must be imposed. That is to say, EPA must impose one or more of 7 different requirements, and this is among them. This is the hammer. By the way, I forgot to say, I talked about manufacture a bit, you know, processing, distribution, and commerce. By the way, that includes exportation, use, or disposal of a chemical substance. I want to talk about disposal. How do we dispose of CO2 in this country or any country? CO2 generated by the combustion of fossil fuels. What do we do with it? Anyone? To date, largely. Very small bit, very, 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 very small bit of sequestration. But I said predominantly, put that to the side. What do we do with it? Put it into air. We just let it rip as if the atmosphere is a free and open sewer, right? And the important thing to understand, just a tiny bit of science, is that CO2, once injected into the atmosphere, is there essentially forever, at least a substantial share, and it's a substantial and growing share, and or is absorbed by the oceans, where it's leading to ocean acidification, all sorts of problems, including problems with respect to the corals, with our food chain, and so on. And the ocean, by the way, also takes up 90% of the surplus heat, the additional heat from global warming. So the oceans are in dire trouble because of this. It's not just heat waves. It's not just drought and wildfire and so on, but we are undermining our oceans. But as I say, once you put it into the environment, it's there essentially forever, many, many millennia. And so I think we have a continuing disposal problem. But TSCA allows the agency to get after the problem of disposal of such chemical substances where it's present an unreasonable risk. Anyhow, I didn't want to forget about that. I'll return to that in a second. So the first hammer under TSCA is that EPA can impose restrictions to the point of prohibition on any of the activities with respect to chemical substances that are injuring the public health or the environment, Here, of course, both are being injured. And secondly, and this goes to disposal, saying a bit more, because a substantial portion and a substantial and growing portion of CO2 remains essentially forever unless we accelerate its removal from the atmosphere and the ocean, so that the environmental systems. The problem of global warming is largely a function of past emissions, the accumulation of emissions to date. And this is the reason why the simple fact that the United States is now only emitting 12% of additional annual emissions, that doesn't in any way let us off the hook, because our cumulative emissions from this nation are the greatest by far of any nation. It also means that our per capita emissions are far greater than, for example, China or India. China is now releasing the most CO2 of any nation in particular, but in terms of per capita emissions, we're far ahead. And in terms of cumulative emissions, and I think it reasonably can say that cumulative emissions are related to a country's responsibility to address the problem, we still remain number one, regrettably. So TSCA 6A specifies that EPA can regulate any manner, regulate to the point of prohibition of any manner or method of disposal of such substance. So this is the hammer to allow the agency to get after the legacy emissions that we need to get after. So put more simply, resolving the crisis of climate change requires us, number one, to rapidly phase out our reliance and our use of fossil fuels, and thus the emissions that result for them. But number two, because we've so overshot the safe level of atmospheric CO2, we need to do more than that, as if that weren't a task great enough. But we also need to remove a substantial portion of the overburden. And the question really is, if we do not do that soon, do we leave that for future generations, and where it may be impossible for them to do that if we continue to add to the problem? And the other question, of course, is who would pay, because it's very expensive, who will pay to remove that overburden of atmospheric CO2? Will it be the citizens who are already paying from various climate-induced damages, or will those oil, gas, and coal companies or national producers, for example, think of Saudi Arabia and Aramco, will they be required to pay a fair share to remove some of the overburden? Now, what I've shown to you is that existing law provides ample authority for the United States Environmental Protection Agency to get after this problem in a serious way. But there's a question of whether they can do so quick enough because we're in a crisis and, we need to have acted yesterday. Here, can you read his slide? Can I read his slide? It says, I'm sure the dinosaurs thought they had time too, which is an important sentiment, although not necessarily scientific, because in fact, the dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid 65 million years ago, not by global warming. And in fact, global warming 250 million years ago helped defeat the giant lizards and helped the dinosaurs come to dominate on the land and the sea. But in any event, that's a bit of a digression. But by the way, this was not the only unscientific sign at the climate march. You will be surprised to know, at least. For example, this woman to your right. Again, a very good sentiment. Make love, not CO2. But there's a problem with that scientifically. I mean, you can do the latter and not the former, but you really can't do the former and not the latter. But again, I digress. So the question here that I'm trying to address is, can we do this fast enough? Can we press EPA to take action without additional undue delay? And the answer, amazingly, is yes, we can. Because of the authority conveyed by Congress to the agency, not in Section 6, which is what I was just talking about, but in Section 7, where if the chemical substance at issue presents not merely an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, and now I need to be very specific in my words here, but an imminently hazardous risk, that the chemicals can be deemed imminently hazardous, which means, per their definition, that it is and again, it's unhappy, that an imminently hazardous chemical is a chemical substance that presents an imminently, this is why it's unhappy, an imminent risk of serious and widespread injury to health or the environment. So not merely an unreasonable, but a serious and widespread risk of injury. Well, if that is the case, then this provision, this Section 7, allows EPA to go immediately to court and seek relief, ranging from seizure of the substances to any such relief that is proven to the court to be necessary. And secondly, it states that concurrently with the filing of an action in court, EPA must immediately or concurrently or as soon as possible, it says, as soon thereafter as may be practicable, initiate a proceeding for the promulgation of the rule under Section 6. Now, and here's the definition. What about that rulemaking under Section 6? How can that be expedited to deal with the emergency nature of the crisis? Yes, it can, because where there is a declaration by the administrator that the substance presents an imminent and serious risk of widespread injury, the administrator's proposed rule to start that rulemaking, because you have notice and comment and you have public hearings and, you got to give industry a fair opportunity for participation in the process. No, EPA can issue the proposed rule, and on the declaration that is needed, make that proposed rule immediately effective. Well, effective immediately upon publication in Federal Register. That only takes a couple of weeks. So to review, to see if we have sufficient authority here. In the context of the current climate emergency, EPA has the ability to act immediately in certain respects, to go to court and seek some relief, and to commence the rulemaking and make its proposed rule immediately effective. So, and that rule can get after the production, including, that can get after the manufacture, including the production and importation of fossil fuels. It can get after the processing or distribution and commerce or use of the fossil fuels. And when I say get after, it can restrict to the point of prohibition. It can get after the method of disposal of the byproducts of the use as intended of these fossil fuels. Ample authority, in my view, to address the problem in a timely way. Yes, time. Okay, so let me quickly wrap up. Can I take 2 more minutes? Okay. So, to relax, my golden retriever, his name is Rafi. 2 days after that march, President Biden gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly in which he said that we need to exercise leadership on the world stage, including with respect to climate, in such a way as to bend the arc of history. And I agree. We cannot feel that just because the fossil fuel industry has dominated our politics and so thoroughly to date with respect to energy policy, that will be the way the way it will be forever. We have the ability, and my organization will be petitioning the EPA, demanding its invocation of these substantial authorities, and all of you can help. We can't do it ourselves. All of you can endorse and sponsor our efforts. It's all the opportunity to do that will be there at our website. The name of the organization is Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. So the first 3 initials, the first 3 words are CPR, you know, like emergency, cprclimate.org. So you can go there and you can get information. But in addition, on Friday, not much is going on when the legislature is not in session on Fridays. I know this. I worked for the California legislature for 5 years. So if you have something to say, come and help us build the record at the University of Hawaii School of Law. In a public hearing, if you register today, you could speak for up to 5 minutes, I think. Or if you register on the day, come there. You can speak for up to 2 minutes. This is from 1 to 4 at the University of Hawaii School of Law. Because we want to answer the question that EPA said required them to deny our prior petition in this area. They said, we don't need to go down this road with the Toxic Substance Control Act. Why? Because we're doing enough already under other law. So go away. They pointed to the IRA and they pointed to future rulemakings. Well, now we've seen the IRA. There's some good things in it. There's some bad things in it. And we've seen their 2 new rulemakings, the one on motor vehicles and the one on power plants. And they're small steps in the right direction, but they leave tremendous quantities of emissions on the table. The EPA and the US government can do more. In fact, they can do much more. That will be my testimony, but come with your testimony. You can attend without testifying, by the way, or you could attend and testify, or you could attend and testify and later on over the next 2 weeks, you could submit for the record, which we will share with the Environmental Protection Agency, additional testimony, you had an additional statement. You could even attach documents to support your positions. So in any event, I'm well over. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I don't leave any room for questions, but maybe there would be some time at the end. Is that fair? Okay. Thank you very much. And Mike, thank you for your patience. And my colleague, Mike Ewall, will now present, and I look forward to his presentation.
Thank you, Dan. For those on Zoom, I just dropped something in the chat that gives you the opportunity to sign up. And those of you here, I think we got you on the paper sign-up sheet, but if you didn't, let's get you on the way out. But there are a lot of events. My last slide will show you some of the other events coming up this week where I'll be presenting, and Dan as well, and some of them. So please sign up there so we can let you know about these other events, give you more information on how to get involved and support some of the good work that's going on. So let me just jump straight into the PowerPoint here. I have a lot more slides than I'll have time to go through, so I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A for those here in person and those on Zoom. So some of these, bear with me if I breeze through certain slides. Feel free to snap pictures or screenshot them and come back later and say, what about that thing that you didn't spend enough time on? Totally welcome. So my name is Mike Ewall. I am the founder and director of a group called Energy Justice Network that I've been with for over 20 years, and I'm now transitioning into Beyond Burning, a new organization to carry on the work I've been doing to help communities around the country fight against dirty energy and waste facilities, with a special focus on the burning of trash and trees and all the bad things you can burn. I've done a lot of work against coal and gas and fossil fuels as well. And let's see if this thing works. It doesn't. That's not good. Okay. What are we doing wrong? Okay. Let's see if this still works. Okay, it's good. Just needed to click the button there and focus on it. Okay, so let's talk first about what false solutions are. There are a lot of things that are posed as climate solutions. A lot of them are not actually climate solutions, or actually, in some cases, climate problems or problems from other perspectives. And these fall into two categories. You have policies that are false solutions, and you have technologies that are false solutions. And usually when the policies are false solutions, it's because they include false solutions that are technologies that are on this list. I won't go into all these because there's many workshops just to break down this slide, but feel free to come back and say, well, what about that one? Why did you put that in the list? I thought that was a clean energy solution. So there are a lot of things in here. And you heard from Dan a lot about Republicans and why they're terrible for the environment. And I'm not disagreeing with an ounce of that. There's all kinds of problems there. However, I'm going to be much more bipartisan about it and point out that Democrats have been atrocious on these issues as well. Not all Democrats, there are some good Democrats, but in general, when we see things like the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which still affects us now in a lot of ways, it was probably the most single anti-environmental bill ever to pass Congress. The Republicans get the blame for that from their backdoor deals under Bush to come up with that idea, but it was the Democrats' version that was written that actually became law. And they rarely get the blame for that, but they wrote the version that was later passed by the Republicans. And you have things like the Inflation Reduction Act, and people are saying, well, Biden did this and it's so great and it's going to help us with the climate. And yet you have something on the order of $30 billion in subsidies for nuclear power, which is a serious problem for all kinds of things in terms of environmental racism, in terms of radioactive pollution, in terms of climate pollution, and in terms of money being sucked away to prevent a transition away from dirty energy. And so there are a lot of problems with that. and just a lot of things here that you might glance at and think, well, I thought that was a solution.
Right.
And there are a lot of problems buried in there. I'm hearing voices, Melody. If you're seeing new people in the Zoom and they're not muted, if you can please mute them as we go. Thanks. Okay, so let's move on. So let's talk about what the real solutions look like. And this is not meant to be comprehensive, but some of the big pieces here. We need to recognize that in this country, we are over-consuming beyond measure. We need to reduce our energy demand. Energy is one of the biggest sectors of emissions that we have, by something on the order of 75% if we want to get anywhere close to global equity and recognizing that there are people that aren't using enough energy to get by. And we need to create space for them to do so, but also get to a point where our climate and our planet can sustain all the people that we have. So we need to make sure that we're cutting our energy demand down dramatically. We need a clean energy mandate similar to what a lot of states have. I had as a fall solution on the previous side, renewable portfolio standards. And that's basically a renewable energy mandate that Hawaii and a lot of other states have. Hawaii says we're going to get to 100% renewable energy by 2045. However, renewable energy here includes burning trash and trees, which are both dirtier than burning coal. You know, you shut your coal power plant down here in Oahu, but they're still burning trash and burning trees on two different islands here. So we need to have these policies redefined and say only stuff that does not involve burning or nuclear or other false solutions, just the clean stuff, and ramp it up to 100% as soon as possible. That is a good type of policy, but they're usually not defined in a clean way, which is why Clean Power Task Force, which I've been working with for the past year on weekly Zoom meetings, has been advancing legislation that I think Senator Gabbard was supporting to try to get burning trash and burning trees not to be considered renewable anymore in Hawaii. We also have huge amounts of money. This number is pretty old, so I have to find a newer one. If anyone has a newer one, share it with me, please. But at one point it was 74 billion a year. It's probably a lot more than that now in annual dirty energy subsidies. And if you add on to that the ridiculously high military budget that we have, which is largely an oil and gas subsidy of its own, there's a lot of money that could be steered toward doing the right thing that really needs to be steered in a better way. We also need to recognize that the waste sector and the agriculture sectors are huge emitters, and we need to have zero waste policies, culture policies, transportation and energy sector policies, so that all of these are climate policies and environmental justice policies, not just one blunt instrument like a carbon tax, thinking that it's going to know how to fix all the nuances in all of these systems because somehow the market knows best. It doesn't. We need to get into all these policies in detail and say, we need to move from these to these specific technologies and methods in a specified time frame, and not think that just trusting the market because you put a price on carbon is somehow going to get us to the right place. But the ultimate thing is at the bottom here. I put 0 because it really is the prerequisite before any of these policies. We can't do what Dan's talking about or what I'm talking about without getting money out of politics. That's why it's impossible to do top-down strategies and just go to Congress and say, pass this big climate bill, and think that it's not going to come out with a Christmas tree full of dirty energy and dirty waste and agricultural policies baked into it, because nothing good comes out of Congress without all kinds of bad stuff hitching a ride along. And usually there's more bad than good. And even climate scientist James Hansen has even said of one of the major climate bills about 10, 15 years ago, that bill, the Waxman-Markey climate bill, was more harm than good, which was strong words coming from him. And I totally agree that you can't get good things happening at that level until we fix our democracy problem. So that's why a lot of the work I've been doing has been focusing at the local level, sometimes at the state level. And a lot of these policies, we can do a better job without compromising working at those lower levels, and then grow up to the point where we're influencing the larger levels of government. Okay, so as I flew in just a couple of days ago, I took this picture. This is Campbell Industrial Park. This is where Oahu sticks almost all of its dirty energy in one concentrated spot where historically the winds blow it out to sea. So folks can think, okay, well, it's okay because all the pollution just goes into the ocean. Well, sometimes that changes. The Kona winds bring it in. And I was just speaking last night at the Pearl City Neighborhood Board where the chair was responding to what I was saying and saying, yeah, when the Kona winds come in, the winds just blow that pollution right up the valley, right to where I live. And I've got asthma and I have to close my windows. And for all we know with global warming, that situation might be increasing or at least air stagnating more, where we can't just trust that all this pollution somehow safely blows it into the ocean and of course into fish that people might be eating. So there are a lot of problems here on Oahu that are existing or proposed. We've got the third largest trash incinerator in the country, which I'll be spending a lot of this presentation to talk about. We also have a landfill where the ash from that incinerator goes, the Waimanalo Gulch landfill, which they've promised many times that would be closing down. They've most recently said it will close down in 2028, but then said they'll pick a new site for a new landfill by the end of last year. And as I completely predicted last year, they didn't do that and ended up deciding, well, let's take 2 more years to decide where we're going to put the landfill. And since they still have space there, I predict that as long as they have space, they're going to keep punting that decision because no policymaker wants to say, this community gets the next landfill. No one wants to do that. So as long as there's space, they're going to keep punting that decision. And there are serious environmental justice, environmental racism issues with where the incinerator sits, where the landfills sit. There's another landfill, the PVT landfill for demolished buildings. The construction and demolition waste generated on Oahu gets piled up in that landfill, which is running out of space and is likely to close. And there's no plan for where that waste will go. They've talked about burning it. I have thought for a while they might try burning it at the coal plant that closed down, but it seems like thankfully that isn't happening. They might then try to burn it at the H-Power trash incinerator next, which is looking for as much waste as possible to burn. And then you've got several other bad ideas that are targeting the island, different companies that want to make aviation fuel out of construction demolition waste, out of trash. They want to make hydrogen. They want to fuel planes with all kinds of waste-based fuels. There's also the Par refinery also in that industrial park that wants to take seed corns and grow them on the islands and also import vegetable oil and turn that into 61 million gallons per year of aviation fuel and other chemicals. Well, that is also a false solution. There are a lot of harms that come from the production system of that. That's not a non-polluting thing just because it's biofuel. And so there are issues there that need to be looked at. So some other pictures I took. Last time I was out here, got a little toxic tour that one of the residents gave. Melody was on that with me and got to see some of these things up close that I've been only reading about, including the Waimanalo Gulch landfill, which we just talked about. Another picture of it from Civil Beats stories on the topic. And this is the map of where they can build a new landfill. The areas that are not colored in, so there are 4 little patches of whitish color on here. That's what's left after all the places that are excluded under different rules to be able to build a landfill. And the one near the bottom, that's very close to the same communities that already have the 2 existing landfills, where a lot of Native Hawaiians are living in that area. And there are aquifers under these areas where they're able to build new ones, including the North Shore patches there. So these are not great places to be putting landfills either. I don't know if there's ever a great place to put one, but we'll discuss some of the things that we might look at for where a landfill could go, because unfortunately, zero waste is not something that we literally get to zero anytime soon. So there's always a landfill at the back of the system somewhere, unless you're doing something even more inappropriate with the waste. And then the PVT landfill for construction demolition waste, that's, there's some pictures I snapped of that there, and it was closed at the time. So they had that picture there. So if we had to have a landfill, which we do have to have, whether it's for ash or trash, we need to have some kind of guidelines for what it is. So whether it's in the same place, where people have really been fighting to close it down, and there have been promises made around that, where if they manage to get it moved somewhere else, I think in order to prevent the divide and conquer of people on this island around it, we need to get all communities at least agreeing that no matter where it is, there's some basic things that should happen to protect any community. And so what I'm proposing here is, first of all, any new landfill, let's site it as far away from where people are actually living to be able to protect the people, but also not place it above aquifers that affect the water supply for other people and for the agriculture. We also want to have as many liner systems. This is especially important for Hawaii Island, where they have no soil. Like the place where they have a landfill is on lava, and that landfill leaks and it's going straight into the ocean. So that they should have at least triple liner systems on that one. But here maybe double would be sufficient. That's what they use for hazardous waste landfills, and in Pennsylvania, municipal waste landfills have that, and they can still leak even with double liners. All landfill liners leak, so you can never have enough. And I would argue that we need to close these incinerators down, that no landfill is safe that has incinerator ash in it, because that's so much more toxic. It's not the size of landfills that hurts people, it's the toxicity. And we need to reduce the toxicity, but also make it as small as possible. So let's ban the recyclables and the clean compostables from it, because we need to do the upstream things and keep things out of the waste stream. And we also need to make sure it's not gassy and stinky. One of the biggest problems with landfills is that they have landfill gas, and they have a climate problem with that. And to keep those gases from forming, we need to keep the food scraps, the yard waste out of the landfill, get that into organic, into aerobic composting. But whatever materials are left, like the sewage sludge, which is one of the few things that belongs in a landfill, is too dangerous, it's too toxic, but it's going to break down quickly. Digest that stuff first, stabilize it biologically so it's not breaking down in the landfill forming gas. You can do that in a vessel where you can capture the gas more. That is one way to stabilize the landfill, so it's smaller, not producing much all the gases and odors and leachate. And then there are different ways that landfills get mismanaged when they try to use them for energy production, try to burn the gas for energy. And usually the ways that they mismanage landfills cause more gas to escape, because they're trying to pretend they're energy facilities when they really need to be managed properly as waste facilities. And that means don't try to make more gas, capture as much as you can, and then filter the toxic chemicals out before you use it, because usually they don't care about that. They're just like, oh, it's just methane. And they forget that there are hundreds of toxic chemicals in there that are exposing communities when you burn it. All right, so let's dive into the incinerator here. The third largest incinerator in the country. There are a couple others that are the same size, so it's tied for third, and it's at 3,000 tons per day. And it's run by the biggest trash incinerator company in the country, Covanta. But it's owned by the county. So it's actually the city and county of Honolulu is the owner, and then the operator is Covanta. And so they have a few different names, but the main one they call it is H-Power, which is this acronym that they made up a while ago. But that's a picture of it. And it's actually like two plants right next to each other. It's an old plant with two burners and then a new one with one. So they aren't even burning at capacity. They're a little over half of their capacity. They could burn up to 3,000 tons per day. But the older two burners, they basically, they call it refuse dry fuel. They pull the glass and metal out that don't burn well, and then take the rest, which is largely food scraps and paper and plastic, and they burn that. And those are about 34 years old now. Now, I've been studying this industry in depth, and there are 50 trash incinerators that have since shut down since 2000. And the average age of those plants when they closed was just 24. Now, this one, 2 out of 3 burners are 34 years old. Rarely do they make it to their 40th birthday. We can't expect that this whole plant, these 2 older burners, are going to be around for more than another 5 or 10 years. Sometimes they'll burn down, like there was one in Florida, in Miami-Dade County, that had a fire that burned, and it was the same style as this plant with the refuse dry fuel. They're more prone to fires. They burned for 3 weeks straight, huge clouds of pollution coming out, not burning where they're supposed to be burning. This is like on fire, the whole plant, or a big portion of it rather, burning uncontrolled, shut down for good now. And this is the first of many. There are two in the DC area, I remember from a handful of years ago, that burned for 2 weeks straight each, and one shut down for 11 months as they spent 40 million rebuilding it. And the community is exposed, and they lie to the community and say, oh, don't worry, we've done some testing and everything's fine. It's just normal household trash burning. Actually, it's industrial waste too, but they didn't say that. And they say, oh, the news, recycling plant on fire. State officials say, oh, nothing to worry about, no health issues. They say this before they even know anything. And of course, they're lying. There's no way a plant that normally has 4 pollution control devices on it, and they're still dirtier than coal power plants when they have those, and then have uncontrolled burning going on of massive, like 3 stories of trash burning, and somehow no health effects. It makes no sense. But they will tell communities this. So this incinerator, especially these older 2 burners, it could burn down anytime. It could break down because these old plants break down all the time. Just this past few days, the oldest one in the country in Saugus, Massachusetts, had a malfunction where it sounded like airplane jets just roaring into the community for about half hour before they figured out what was going on, when they tested something and something else was breaking and they didn't realize it. So a lot of pollution and noise from that. And on top of this, they are missing 2 of the 4 pollution control devices that most incinerators have. Most have controls for the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks. These first 2 burners have no controls for that. They also have a control device that takes out the most toxic chemicals like mercury and dioxins. They're missing that too on the first 2 burners, the older 2 of this plant. So there's no excuse for that. Any new incinerator built in the past decade, it will be illegal to build it without that. And the 3rd burner, the new one that was built 10 years ago, I'm sorry, the slides cut off because the zoom bar there, but if they were built in the past decade, they would not be allowed to build that new one either, because it's not using the modern controls for the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks. It would have to meet a limit that's at least half of what they're currently required to meet. And so you can't build any of this plant today and operate it legally, but because they were built so many years ago, they're allowed to. So this year, when I last took the numbers from EPA and looked at how does this incinerator compare to other power plants on the island here, I found that it's one of the biggest polluters. If we look at in the first, the upper left one here, you can see the hydrochloric acid emissions are just off the charts, that orange bar, compared to a coal plant right next to it, the AES one that's now shut down. The other 3 are burning oil. And you just see much greater or comparable emissions from burning trash than the fossil fuels. If you look at what they call criteria air pollutants, you see the nitrogen oxides are right up there with the 3 oil burning power plants, and other pollutants are comparable. If you look at the toxic emissions, I'm sorry, the bottom part's cut off, but I think that blue bar is lead, the green one is mercury. And so you'll see that those emissions are also comparable or much greater than what you get from the fossil fuels. And that last one is the carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas emissions, far worse than any of the fossil fuel power plants when you burn trash. And we find this across the board in the whole country. Now, this here is just a slide we made from Baltimore, just looking at the different standards for the nitrogen oxides that trigger asthma attacks. A lot of them have standards that are up around 150, 170 parts per million. That's probably what the permit is here. And yet anything built in the last decade has to meet a modern standard of 45 parts per million. And so they're allowed to put out about 3 times more asthma triggering pollution than a modern incinerator would even be permitted to have. And they just don't have the controls. Actually, the older 2 burners have no controls. They're probably way above the top of that chart. They also, like when you look at the different pounds of pollutants they're putting out, you can see they're one of the biggest polluters in the whole island. And these rankings are probably a little bit worse now because the coal plant is shut down last year. So some of the things that are 4, number 5, they're now probably number 3 or number 4. And so no matter which pollutant you look at, you see there's a lot of stuff coming out, even the small ones like mercury, 15 pounds. You might think, well, how bad is 15 pounds? Well, 1 gram of mercury, the amount in a single fever thermometer when they used to use mercury, is enough to make a 20-acre lake so contaminated that you can't eat the fish safely. And yet, if someone can do the math on 15 pounds versus grams, I don't have the numbers in my head right now, but it's thousands of 20-acre lakes where the fish are too contaminated by just 15 pounds of mercury coming out a year. That's a huge amount of mercury. So, I mean, the ocean, of course, is much bigger than a 20-acre lake, but, you're going to have mercury in the fish, even in the ocean, being contaminated by the amount of mercury being put out here. Okay, so some other just general slides on trash incineration. Some of these I'm going to breeze through because we don't have time to get into the full depth of it. But this is where the incinerators are in the country. I live in the middle of that crazy cluster in Philadelphia, surrounded by more incinerators than anywhere, 5 of them. One's the biggest in the nation. And this is the overall trend. We see that this industry has peaked in the early 90s. They're now down to 66 that are left, and more keep closing every year. 2 just closed this year, 1 from burning down, 1 from running out of money. And there are more happening every year. And my job is to close all of these in the next 10 years if I can. That's my mission. And so I need your help, because of all the ones that are going to be hardest to finish getting closed down are going to be the ones in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Florida, and this one here in Hawaii, because they're the newer ones and the ones with the most subsidies being thrown at them in some cases. So it's going to take extra work here to get this one closed. And what I mentioned earlier, a lot of them, as they age, are closing down. Their average age when they close is getting older, only because the older ones are finally closing. But still, their average age being 24, when you have one that's pushing 30 something into 40, it's only got so many days left anyway. Now, there are a lot of names that are used for this industry. They call it waste to energy, energy from waste, or they have other types. They used to call it trash to steam, as if there's just water vapor coming out. Of course, they don't need air pollution permits if it's just water vapor coming out. And then they have a lot of other terms. Some of these technologies I now classify as waste to fuel, but they learned that they have an acronym problem with that, so they don't call them WTF. I like to do that, but yeah. So a lot of other terms of newer types of incinerators that are threatening Oahu specifically right now, like pyrolysis, gasification. These are things that insist that they're not incinerators. However, EPA still defines and regulates them as incinerators. They're basically incinerators that are 2-stage. So they say, we're not burning in this first step, but then the second step, they burn the stuff that comes out of the first step. So, they like to play word games with us. One of those word games, when I first got involved, they would call it trash to steam. I like to rebrand it and say that's actually trash to toxic ash and toxic air emissions, because we're not just throwing ice cubes in our trash can. That would make steam if we burn that, but we can't burn water. I mean, I can burn water, but anyway, that's my special talent. They also call it waste to energy a lot, and we like to rebrand that and say, well, it's actually waste of energy, because when you look at the studies that have been done on this, if you take the same materials that we could be recycling and composting that are in the trash stream and recycle and compost them, you save 3 to 5 times more energy than you can get back by burning them. The embodied energy, like if you think of paper, you cut down a tree, you chainsaws and other equipment, bring it to a paper mill, you're burning coal or maybe tires in that paper mill, and then you ship it to a staple store and you buy that paper. All the energy it took to get that paper to you is energy you can't get back by burning it. It's embodied energy. It's not physically in that paper. It went out of smokestacks and tailpipes just to get it there. But if you recycle that paper, now you don't have to do all those steps again. And so that's why it makes a lot more sense to be doing the right thing than thinking that you're getting all the value back by burning. Now, when I say garbage in, garbage out, if you put toxic things like mercury in the waste stream and put it in an incinerator, it comes out somewhere. It's an element. You can't destroy it. And so whatever goes in is coming out. It's just, it might change the chemicals in some cases, but it's still bad things that are often coming out if there are bad things going in. It's generalizing a little bit too much there, but it depends on the chemicals. And nothing is 100%. So if they say, we have these controls on our smokestack, even though they're missing half of them, 2 of the burners, but nothing is 100% being removed. So they can have scrubbers on some of this and they'll get maybe 90% out, but the amount that's still coming out is still enough to be dangerous, to the point where it's on par with fossil fuel plants and is still bad for people's health. Of course, very bad for the climate. So if incineration is the answer, someone's asking the wrong question, because whatever perspective you look at this industry through, you find that there are better answers than burning. And one of the dangers of this is it makes the problem invisible. You have a black box technology, and people and decision makers in particular think, okay, well, the problem just goes away. You put it here, you burn it up, and now we don't have to worry about a landfill. Of course you do. The ash has to go somewhere. But it makes it easy for decision makers to just say, okay, well, it's going to reduce it, make it go away, turns into good things. And then you just don't have to think about it and do the difficult part of having the right policies to reduce waste in the first place. So 10 years ago, I was actually testifying in DC City Council and made the argument that trash incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. So there are actually 4 arguments in there. The mouthpiece for the industry, Ted Michaels, who headed the trade association, this is before they renamed it, so they're not the Energy Recovery Council anymore, it's the Waste to Energy Association. But he admitted on the record, this is on video, that I was right on 2 of those 4 points. And this is one of his quotes saying, yes, it's more expensive than a landfill to use an incinerator. Of course, they call it waste to energy. So in this quote, he doesn't use the I word, but same idea. And the industry's trade association, not for trash incineration, but for waste in general, it's a different trade association. They made this chart. This is not my chart. And they documented that incineration is more expensive than landfilling on average across the country. Of course, it can change regionally. Hawaii also often has different dynamics going on, but in general, it's a more expensive thing to be doing. This here is from the federal government. This is the last time, this is about 10 years old now. I'm sorry to have outdated information sometimes, but that's because there's nothing newer in this case, because no one's building new incinerators anymore. And so they stopped reporting on this 10 years ago. But the last time that they did include this industry in the Energy Information Administration's reports, they documented that it's more expensive to build and to operate and maintain a trash burner than any other form of energy that they studied. And what I find fascinating about this is that the operations and maintenance is largely about the cost of the fuel. Well, trash incinerators get paid to take their fuel. It's not like a fossil fuel plant where they have to pay to get coal, oil, or gas, or a nuclear reactor where they have to pay to get uranium that goes through 5 different steps of processing just to get to be a fuel rod. They get paid to take their fuel, and it's still the most expensive of all the options, which says a lot about, especially about all the pollution control devices that they need. And even with them, they're still dirtier than burning coal. So it's a very expensive industry. And one of the things that makes it so crazy in the contracts that they have to have, and we see this here on Oahu, is that they often have what are called put or pay clauses in their contracts. In other words, you have to pay them to give them a certain amount of waste. And if you don't give them that amount of waste, you have to pay anyways if you did, which is deadly to doing the right thing. If you want to reduce waste here in Oahu, then you get penalized for that. If you recycle, compost, or even better, reduce and reuse a lot, then the county has to, and they'll pass along the cost to you, they have to pay H-Power to not use them as much, which is one reason why we're hearing about recyclables getting burned instead of recycled, why we're hearing about any other thing they can feed the incinerator, because it's a beast that needs to be fed, and the contracts keep that locked in. So you can't do the right thing and have an incinerator because they're just incompatible just financially. Now, we used to think that they compete with the recycling also because they need the things that burn well, like paper and plastic. I've been on tours of incinerators where they've admitted to me and seen other presentations from the same company that runs this one, where they admit that they love plastics recycling all of a sudden. There's too much energy value in the plastics, and they would rather have the compostable stuff, the wetter stuff, to cool down their system, because there's only so much energy value they can put through their burner at one time. And so if they get too much plastic in the waste stream, which has been increasing over time, then they actually can't feed as much waste, and they get paid per ton of waste. So they actually are finding that they like the idea of recycling plastics all of a sudden. They want to compete more with composting. I'll skip some of these examples, but a lot of financial disaster stories from other parts of the country. Quickly on jobs, you have the fewest amount of jobs per amount of waste when you burn or bury trash. Incinerators are actually slightly worse than landfills in that. But recycling, you get about 5 to 10 times as many jobs. Reuse, you get even more. This is in more detail. You can see as many as about 300 times more jobs when you're talking about electronics recycling, and different numbers depending on the material. Now, I kept saying that incineration is worse than coal. Let's look at some of the numbers on that. This is from analyzing this nationally with the latest EPA data that we had about a year ago. It's numbers from 2018 here. And we find that on almost all the major pollutants that we studied, that per unit of energy, so to make the same amount of energy burning trash versus coal, you get a lot more pollution from burning trash. And that's even though these plants are generally newer and have more pollution control devices on them than coal plants do. And they're still that much dirtier. New York State put out the same information when they still had 8 coal plants running. This was back in 2011. They're all shut down now. But this is from the state environmental agency. So I didn't make up these numbers at all. These are the numbers they found versus the 10 trash incinerators they have in that state, more than any other state. And except for sulfur dioxide, where the coal plants were worse, all the other ones, trash burning was worse. Mercury, 14 times worse than coal, which we know is horrible in terms of mercury emissions, but burning trash is that much worse. Now, when I presented this back at that meeting in DC, I was testifying, and the incinerator industry mouthpiece had to defend against my accusation that they're dirtier than coal. And then all of a sudden, when they like to talk about themselves as if they're energy facilities, because it sounds better than being a waste facility, all of a sudden they're waste facilities again, because it's like, oh, it's not fair to compare us to coal plants. So, we're primarily waste facilities, and electricity output is a secondary function. So it's interesting how, their PR spin has to change once you're like, well, okay, if you're an energy facility, let's compare you to coal. Oh, no, can't do that. That's forbidden. So comparing to coal again, if we look on climate, we see that they're 65% worse than burning coal for the climate, yet they act like they're a climate solution. They actually have charts that take that orange part and they say, well, first of all, that part doesn't count. All those emissions coming out of our smokestack, literally, well, that came from growing plants and trees. And so that's biogenic carbon. And somehow that doesn't count because, trees are going to regrow. Okay. Well, climate scientists since at least 2009 have been debunking that and say, well, that's double counting. We already assume trees are regrowing in global climate models. So you can't just say, well, they regrow so that carbon doesn't count. But that's what they do. And that's what they do when they're trying to burn trees like they're doing on Kauai and have been trying. People have been fighting for over a decade on Big Island against Huhonua, trying to burn trees for renewable energy. And they say, oh, our carbon emissions are 0 because, they're trees, and that doesn't count. Well, it does count. It's in case of biomass, it's about 50% worse than burning coal for the climate. But that's if you actually measure what's coming out and count it all and not let them play these math games where they pretend that they're a climate solution. And yet studies have shown, like when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts hired Manomet Center for Conservation Scientists or Sciences and asked, how many years does this extra pulse of CO2 take to get sucked up by newly growing trees? And that study came back saying about 45 years. And that's not to be carbon neutral. That's to be equal to coal. So after 45 years, which we don't have that kind of time with global warming, it's going to be as bad as coal. And then hundreds of years to get down to carbon neutral if the trees keep regrowing, don't get cut down, and you don't really hit 0. So it's a lot of PR that's trying to sell this as a climate solution when in fact they're the worst things out there for the climate. And I'll point out that when we talk about this, all the groups that work on carbon taxes and different types of policies that are aimed to go after carbon emissions from the power sector exempt these industries. They don't regulate biomass. They don't regulate trash incineration. They only regulate fossil fuels, even though about half of the emissions from a trash incinerator are fossil fuels because they're oil-based plastics that are producing the other half. Okay, so dioxins, let's not spend too much time on this, but they're the most toxic chemicals known to science. They're largely produced from incineration. If you're not vegan, you have an incentive to do so, because this chart here, that's actually what made me go from vegetarian to vegan. This is where you get your dioxin in your diet. And you'll notice a trend here that almost all of it is meat and dairy products. It loves fat and hates water, climbs with the food chain very rapidly. And some of the worst the health impacts are caused by this are almost everything. It's cancer, birth defects, endometriosis, you name it, all kinds of things. Diabetes are caused by these toxic chemicals that come from burning trash and other kinds of burning. And then we eat it if we eat meat and dairy products. All right, so let's talk about the smokestack story for a minute. Anything with the smokestack has a similar story. I get calls from folks in like Kansas and, wherever, at different places that I haven't not even heard of these communities. And they'll say, this company wants to do this. And I'm like, did they tell you this story? And they're like, that's exactly what they said. How do you know? It's the same everywhere. So what they'll tell you is, don't worry, we are going to have continuous monitors on our smokestack. We'll know what's coming out at all times. And the state will have the information. They're very rigorous enforcers. And so we'll know if we're going over a limit, and they'll hit us really hard and fine us if we go over that limit. And the limits mean it's healthy and safe. So because we're below that limit, trust us, we're okay. It can't hurt anybody. That's what they say. Now let's break that down. Covanta, the company that runs this incinerator, first of all, they're not always within their permit limits. And when they are fined, those fines are not enough to deter their behavior. We've seen, like in one just north of me in Philadelphia, where they've been having routine malfunctions for the past few years, burning plastic and electrical fire odors and noises in the community, and illegal activities in terms of what they're doing that's causing this. And the state gave them a big fine of about $200,000 a couple of years ago. That was about 3 days of tipping fee revenue, like the trucks coming in paying to dispose of trash. Not enough to stop the fact that they continue to have these same problems for another couple of years, because those fines are not enough to make them say, okay, we need to install new, very expensive boilers or whatever it is that they might need to avoid those problems. And they can't meet modern limits, which I discussed earlier. If they were built today, they wouldn't be allowed to operate the way they're currently operating. But EPA is supposed to update the standards for this industry and others every 5 years. They haven't done so in 16 and have been sued, and federal courts have told them that they have to come up with new standards by the end of this year. Now the industry is suing to delay that, but they're not even at the standards that they should have, even for these older plants that are held to weaker standards. And the permits are not based on health and safety. If they were, there will be a certain amount of pollution that can come out, and anything more than that hurts the community and you can't put that out. But instead, they let things like Campbell Industrial Park exist, where they have an oil refinery and another oil refinery and power plants and incinerators and everything concentrated there. And each one gets a permit as if it's on the moon and nothing else is around it. And so these have nothing to do with health and safety. They're technology-based standards. We've had multiple state regulators admit that to us. Some we've gotten recorded. And it's clear to those who understand how this is done, but most in the public just hear, oh, the permits say this and they're under it, therefore be happy, there's nothing to worry about. And that's not what that means. Now, there are also concentration-based limits. These limits are in parts per million or nanograms per driest standard cubic meter. It's all per something. So if you have a 500 ton per day trash incinerator, it will be allowed to put out a certain amount of pollution, but because yours is 6 times bigger than that, it's allowed to put out 6 times more pollution. If it were health-based, it would not be something where bigger gets to be dirtier. And there are only 3 pollutants that are monitored continuously at most of these plants. So I'll get into that more in a second. This company, we also know that they've been caught rigging their stack tests, their once-a-year tests, and also even rigging their continuous monitoring sometimes. They've been busted for that in Connecticut years ago. And for a number of these pollutants, there is no safe dose of the pollutants they're putting out. And so you can't say, oh, don't worry because our permit, we're under that, when there isn't a safe amount of the things that they're releasing. So this here is an analogy that I like to use on this industry. If we regulated smokestacks in this country for most pollutants, the way we regulate motorists on the highway, we would let people, sorry, I reverse that. If we regulated motorists the way we do smokestacks, then we would let people drive around all year with no speedometer on their car. And once a year, we would set a speed trap on the highway, and there would be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And then the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap because they hire their own consultants to do the testing. They know it's coming up. It's not a surprise. It's an open book test. So that's literally how most pollutants at these plants are regulated. And yet we have the technology to measure at least 50 different chemicals on a continuous basis, but they still only require 3, maybe 4 in some cases. And we know from some studies that exist that when you use the continuous monitoring, we find that there are much higher emissions in reality than what once a year tests are showing us. In Europe, they found for dioxins, the most toxic chemicals known to science, between 30 and 1,300 times higher emissions in reality than what the once a year test is telling us. In this one of the incinerators near me, the biggest one in the country in Philadelphia area, for the hydrochloric acid emissions, they have continuous monitors for that. And I found that those monitors are showing 80% higher emissions than their once a year testing shows, which is how most plants are tested. So we have a bill. We is in this case, the Hawaii's Clean Power Task Force. I've been meeting with Melody and others weekly for the past year, and we've been trying to get good policies passed here in this building. And one of the ones we pushed for, I described earlier, to get trash and tree burning not to be renewable. But the other one that we're working on for this coming year is to require continuous monitoring for these different pollutants. Now, we just got a bill like this passed in Oregon, where Covanta has a much smaller incinerator, the only one in that state, about 500 tons per day. And they're going to have to be the first in the country to use continuous monitors for toxic metals and for dioxins and some other chemicals. Well, here we took that, made it even better of a bill. And you can see in that column with the red and yellow, that's currently what they're required to do. So the yellow is annual, the green is continuous. The yellow pollutants they test once a year. The red, they don't test at all. And we want to move it to the green column where all those things have to be continuously tested. The data is put on a website real time for the world to see. And so the emperor that's wearing no clothes right now, we'll start to, no, that's not a good analogy. They won't start wearing clothes. So I guess we'll see that they're naked, right? So we'll know how much they're really putting out once we force them to actually put these monitors in their smokestack and tell us the truth about what's really going on. Okay, so a little bit about ash, and then I'm going to run out of time here. So try to wind this up. So the reason we have coffee beans on here is an analogy. If we take coffee beans and pour water over it, you're not going to get coffee, right? But you grind them up and increase the surface area, now you get coffee. Well, it's the same principle with ash versus trash. If you increase the surface area by burning trash, like if you take this cell phone, you chuck it in a landfill, how easy is it going to be for the toxic metals and other things in here to get to me in a form that I can breathe or drink or eat this? Right? It's going to take a while. It's not going to be easy for that to happen. But you burn it and instantly 70% of it is now in the air, because for every 100 tons you burn, 70% of that 70 tons are now air pollution, 30 tons are now ash. But the ash is smaller pieces that can blow off of trucks, can blow off of the landfill into the community, can have rainwater go through it and make leachate, or coffee in the analogy, and poison the groundwater. So the toxic things that are in there can get out more easily, and there are new toxic chemicals that weren't there to begin with because they were created by burning. So that is just a general sense of why it's so dangerous to take trash and turn it into ash and air pollution. So when we studied and compared incinerators to landfills, zoom through some of these here. I'm going to skip over why landfills are bad. Feel free to ask me if you're not sure why they're so terrible. But in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, I've been working a lot there, and that's where the biggest incinerator in the country is. And they decided they're moving away from their incinerator and coming up with a zero waste plan. And this is the cover page for that plan that's in the process of coming out. And in that plan, there's a life cycle analysis that looks at the incinerator, the first 2 bars, versus the landfill. The second bar is if you let them subtract things like electricity, offsetting, gas burning somewhere else. And so if we subtract those emissions or let them play that game, then they're the middle bar. Still far worse than going to a landfill. The blue is the greenhouse gases. So most of this is climate damage, but the red, you have damage from toxic chemicals. Sorry, the labels are cut off here. The brown is the particulate matter that causes heart attacks and strokes. The yellow is the asthma attacks caused by nitrogen oxides. So you can see all that adds up to a lot more harm than if you go straight to the landfill to begin with. And here's when they looked at that zero waste plan. And so you can see the first two bars, there's going from the status quo using the incinerator versus going to the landfill, but also reducing waste and doing all the zero waste things. You see an 85% reduction in the amount of harm from that waste system. But when you look at the benefits, so the first of the big bars, that's the current benefit of the damage that's not happening because they're recycling and composting to some degree. And if you implement those zero waste plan, you double those benefits or avoid those harms by communities elsewhere, like probably in China and other places where a lot of goods are being produced and things are being extracted. That harm is reduced by having a zero waste system. And here's the third slide from that study. The last column, the worst one is the incinerator. The first three are the landfill under different scenarios of what % gas they're capturing. So even if they capture none of their gas, which is not something you'll find, they're all capturing their gas, usually about 70-some%. But even if they capture none of their gas, it's still worse to burn it than to go straight to the landfill. And a lot of times they say, well, what if the incinerator is closer and the landfill is further away and the hauling, the trucks are really bad, right? Well, the trucks are actually so insignificant in this equation that you can barely notice them. The collection, of course, those red trucks, they have to happen anyway. But the hauling of like getting from the transfer station to the disposal facility, that's in yellow. And you see in the incinerator, it's just a very small sliver. But hauling a few counties away to that Rolling Hills landfill is just a little bit bigger sliver. There's no distance you can bring trash, especially here on islands, where you can make an argument that the hauling of trucks somehow outweighs the impact of an incinerator versus a landfill. So there's no transportation argument to be made that says, well, H-Power is closer to the population center here, and if we put a landfill further out, then all those trucks make it worse. It would never make it worse because the transportation emissions don't catch up to the harm of the incinerator or even the landfill. So this is from another study in Maryland of the same sort of things. You can see incinerator versus landfill. Sorry, the labels are cut off. And this study found the same part about the transportation being a very small fraction of the system. The blue and black bars are the transportation on this one on top of the impacts from the landfills in yellow versus the incinerator in red. And here is the same type of study done for Hawaii. So this is bringing it home here. This looked at, this is a study recently done for the county of Hawaii, Big Island. And the green bars are the impacts of recycling. These are 4 different materials. The first 2 are paper, the second 2 are plastics. And so the green bar is the benefit of recycling those materials, even though this is talking about barging them thousands of miles to Asia to get to recycling markets, okay? So when I talk about the transportation, that's even true for barging across the ocean. Does not make the impact of recycling bad. It's still very positive in those green bars. But landfilling in brown versus incineration in yellow, you can see that if it's paper, landfilling, yeah, that paper is breaking down, so you have some impacts, but not as much as if you burn it and put all that CO2 straight into the air. With plastics, it's much more stark because the plastics going to a landfill and the brown bars you can barely see are basically sitting there. They're not going anywhere. And that's good. Oftentimes people say, well, landfill, that stuff's going to sit there forever. Good. That's what we want. We want plastic to sit there forever and not go anywhere because that's much better than injecting it into the atmosphere immediately, which is the yellow bars. And that's what a lot of people are not understanding when they think, oh, landfills, they're bad. That's going to end up in the ocean, right? Well, no. I mean, yeah, things are ending up in the ocean, but not because they go to a landfill, unless you have a landfill on the coast and like tidal waves hit it or something. So let's not do that. But generally, something that stays put, that's a good thing compared to burning it and then, we're breathing it and everything else. Okay, so health impacts, we'll run through this quickly. There are studies on this showing largely cancers around people that live around incinerators are increasing, and some other diseases as well. The industry likes to say there's no impact from it. So I found the studies where they actually did find impacts, and yeah, mostly cancers. There's also environmental racism. It's a trend in this industry. Even though 2/3 of the incinerators are in majority white communities, the larger ones like this one, very disproportionately in communities of color, in this case, affecting Native Hawaiian communities the most. And the whole industry in general impacting people of color more, because the larger ones are in more populated areas, and the whole industry as a whole is then affecting more people of color than a lot of industries do. Big disproportionate impacts. Okay, how am I doing on timing? Okay, almost at the end, and I hope we can stay past noon to take Q&A. I don't know if we get kicked out of here in 4 minutes. I hope not, but tell me if I need to kill it right now. So zero waste, some positive things here. Zero waste is defined, and I helped write this definition. I work with the Zero Waste International Alliance on one of their advisory bodies and help define what zero waste means internationally. And it's defined to say no burning, and then minimizing the amount and avoiding landfills as well. But there's an effort to make sure that it prioritizes not burning. And the goal is to get 90% reduction from landfills. Of course, the goal is really zero, but everyone says, well, that's unrealistic. What are you, crazy utopian people? You know, like, this is the real world. Well, a lot of places have zero in their policy names. We have zero safety defects and zero drug tolerance and zero injuries in the workplace. What CEO is going to get up and say, well, this year we're going to injure 5 workers, right? You get left out of the room, right? But we do that with waste all the time. We say, well, we're going to create this amount of waste and only recycle this amount. And so if you're not for zero waste, how much waste are you for, right? No one's for waste. It's just that we are not getting creative about putting the right policies in place and making sure that we can get as close to zero and keep trying to get to zero, even though we'll never get to literal zero, but you don't give up at some point back. Okay, well, 30% recycling is good enough. And a lot of places have stopped around there. This is my zero waste experiment. When I collected all my trash, every 3rd month, I would just put in a Ziploc bag everything I had, and my bags got smaller over time as I learned what replacement things I can get, like not buying toilet paper in the big plastic thing when they sell it in paper wrapping. So the toilet paper one, that was January. I encourage that experiment too, not because this is about individual saviorism, you know, it's not, but it'll educate yourself and you can help educate others. And then the fact that institutionally, I was able to have a place for my compost to go and have a place for other things to go, and I knew where those things were, that made it possible for me to do this. We need to have the policies in place so that it's easy for people to produce only a Ziploc bag worth of trash in a month and not like many times that per week. There are a lot of policies that help get us there too, like what they call pay as you throw, and there are a bunch of other names for it at the top. But that's basically when you pay per bag or per bin, then pretty much instantly people reduce waste by about 44% on average. About half of that is waste that's not even going into recycling bin. It's not even being produced in the first place. They pay attention to what they buy and they reduce and reuse more, which is even better. And just having all the other policies in place, like that picture we're using again, that's a deconstruction crew in Baltimore. They dismantle houses instead of demolishing them and reduce the construction and demolition waste, which is a serious issue here and on Kauai, where you're running out of landfill space for that material and you're going to be in a crisis soon enough. And if you don't start dismantling buildings instead of taking wrecking balls to them, you're not going to have a place to put that stuff. So that is very important, and you create a lot of jobs doing the alternatives. Sorry, just silly slide, slowing down things. Okay, I'm going to skip these for now. Austin has a great plan to get to zero waste up to 90% over several years. This is EPA's waste management hierarchy. Now, we got them last summer to put a disclaimer on this policy, because this is what your state and city and a lot of states and cities are using. They copy EPA and say, well, EPA says incineration, which they call energy and recovery, is better than landfills. Well, when I met with them, we had folks from around the country meet with them a year and a half ago. They admitted that they have 0 citations to back that up. And when that happened, I was like, well, can you take that chart down then and stop promoting that? And they're like, well, we can't do that yet. We have to rethink about, well, we could put disclaimer on it. So we got disclaimer, and that little disclaimer on the side is now on their website. But cities and states don't know that and are still copying this and say, well, EPA knows best. They must have science to back this up. And they say incinerators are better. Well, they can't say that because they don't really know that yet. But in the zero waste hierarchy, where we based it on science that I showed you results of earlier, incineration is unacceptable. It's in the red triangle at the bottom. Landfills are the backstop because we know they're bad, but they're not as bad as burning and then landfilling ash. So what we really need to do is all the upstream stuff and then make sure that we have small, stable landfills at the back end. I'll just skip over some of this, a little bit repetitive here. Plastics also a little repetitive, but you can see this is a different study that showed that if you have to dispose of plastics and not have the benefits of recycling or source reduction at the bottom, you want to pick a landfill over burning it because they're going to sit there and not do much harm, whereas burning it does a lot more. And don't think compostable plastics are the answer. They're really another false solution where you have them made from biotech corn, which is like mutating amphibians, harming workers and farmers. And then you have estrogen-like chemicals leaching out of them into the foods we're eating them with too. And then people don't know where to throw them, and whichever bin they throw it in is a problem, whether it's a composting bin and it can't accept that material, or a recycling bin and it's a contaminant, or a trash bin and it's probably worse than a landfill if it actually breaks down than if you just put plastic in there that doesn't. So it's a lose-lose situation. So let's not go for this. We need to move away from single-use materials and disposable stuff in the first place. This is just the study showing how it leaches more hormone affecting chemicals than other types of plastics. This is the second worst type of plastic is the compostable one for that. So I think that's it. We've got a number of upcoming events. Those of you still on Zoom in the chat, please click on that link. And if you sign up there, we'll have your email and can send you this so you don't have to try to capture it from the slide. And those of you who signed up here, the same thing. A number of different events happening this week and more after that in Kauai and Hawaii Island that I'll be visiting next. And a lot of events where you can take a deeper dive, ask more questions, and just learn a lot of fun stuff. So here's my info. If you want to catch it, that's mike@beyondburning.org at the bottom where it's a little chopped off. And let's find out our time check first. Are we getting kicked out of here in -2 minutes, or we have time for Q&A? Yes, we're getting kicked out. We have a tone in. Okay, so can we like hang out in the hallway and do questions, or how does that work? Okay, wait till someone kicks us out. Is that it? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So what should we do? Should we wait till we get kicked out? Is that, well, let's ask the person in charge. Is that okay, or should we just pack up now?
Yeah, I mean, if there's people here who have questions.
Okay. All right, great. Well, we have a question already, so let's take it. And if someone can, Melody, can you pay attention to online questions too, in case we have online ones? That'd be great. Okay, yes, let's hear your question. Mm-hmm. Great.
You can just briefly talk about how the hydrogen option evolves.
Mm-hmm.
Option.
Yeah.
I know the nuclear option is not available to our customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's certainly being portrayed nationally as
Mm-hmm.
a better option.
Yeah.
Option. I know that the permit is $18,000
Yeah.
cost share.
Yeah. It's huge subsidies.
Company, but with high say rating
Mm-hmm.
as another option.
Right.
Because they say that they can take already
Mm-hmm.
purpose that.
Yeah.
They're presenting that as a better option.
Yeah.
How is that, or how does that stack up with the options?
Mm-hmm.
And because it's not an option, let's see what options do we have at the state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, a lot of questions in there. Let's see how fast I can do this, and feel free to hit me up later for deeper ones. So sometimes I've done whole workshops on nuclear. Let me walk you through what a nuclear fuel chain looks like really quick. It starts with mining uranium. That's largely impacting indigenous lands in the southwestern US or Aboriginal lands in Australia or other communities of color around the world. So one of the worst, the most extreme environmental racism trend in any industry we studied is on uranium mining. Off the charts in terms of indigenous people. and they've been incredibly exposed from that and bringing stuff back to their families and still fighting for decades later for compensation from the health harms. Then you go to the second step of milling. So also in the Southwest, a few communities with uranium mills that are also very poisoned communities from that industry. Then you've got conversion. Also, one of them was on indigenous lands in Oklahoma. Now the only one in the country is in Metropolis, Illinois, where workers have organized. Hundreds of workers have died from exposures there. There's actually an action they did with White Crosses, 300 of them in a field, just to symbolize all the workers that have died from exposure there. Then you've got uranium enrichment, another huge environmental racism trend in terms of where they tried to build new ones. But also you got plants in Ohio and Kentucky that are incredibly polluted. They have whole coal plants devoted to powering them. Even years after they close, they still have to keep the coal plants running to keep a disaster from happening at the shut down nuclear facility, because it can't totally shut down without causing more damage. And a lot of the ozone depleting chemicals that are still legally released in the country are coming from just those plants that are still allowed to use them. So a lot of issues there, including depleted uranium, where they end up with the uranium-238, which is most of what's mined in uranium, but that's not as useful as the 235. So they need to enrich it at those plants and get that 235 portion up to 3 to 5% to use in reactors, or 90% to use in weapons. And so around the world, when we're like, how did India get nuclear weapons? Oh, we gave them the peaceful atom years ago to give them the centrifuges that they talked about with Iraq years ago. Like, how'd they get centrifuges and what are they doing with that? And Iran now, well, that's the same process to get to nuclear reactors as to get to weapons. You just have to use it more. And they end up with this depleted uranium as they separate that out. That's the 238, and they don't know what to do with all that waste and sitting in leaking drums in Ohio and Kentucky. And so they use it in war and then contaminate places like Vieques, Puerto Rico. That's testing for war, but they use it in Iraq, where they've had like kids in Basra Hospital with leukemia because they picked it up, Gulf War veterans coming home with diseases, and even their partners, when they have sex, having burning sensations from just the uranium coming out of the man's system when they're having sex, to try to sanitize this a bit. But the health impacts, the birth effects, that just from Gulf War veterans coming back from using radioactive munitions that they didn't realize were radioactive because they weren't told. You've got whole areas of Iraq and other war zones that are contaminated with this nuclear waste that we've used in war. And that's just step 4 of the system. And then you get to fuel fabrication, largely in the Carolinas, where communities are being polluted when they make the fuel rods. And then you get to the reactors, where it's clean. And not really, but they tell people that. And so this is the one industry we've studied that's in wealthier and whiter communities than average in most cases. Some it's a different story, but a lot of them aren't, because they thought in the 70s when they built these, oh, it's clean energy. They didn't realize that they're going to end up with routine radioactive air and water releases, as well as the solid waste, as well as accident risks. But those routine releases are causing birth defects, leukemia, and infant mortality to be higher in those communities. And then you got the nuclear waste that there's no place to put. All 6 low-level nuclear waste dumps in the country have leaked. There's no permanent storage place. They keep trying to dump it on indigenous lands. About 60 different places they've tried to temporarily or permanently store nuclear waste, and I think every single one has been on indigenous lands. So very racist trend there as well. It's so expensive and takes so long that when they do manage to build new ones, we're talking over a decade to build it, billions of dollars of overrun. So they might come in and say, oh, it's a $4 billion plant, and then it's 11 billion by the time they're done building it, if they even finish building it. We don't have the time or money to put in to this industry, even to keep subsidizing the new ones. The Inflation Reduction Act, $30 billion, a lot of it to keep subsidizing existing reactors. That money would do so much more for the climate if we shut those reactors down and put that money into conservation, efficiency, wind, solar, and energy storage. And yet, for some reason, the nuclear lobby's got more money than those clean solutions. And that's why we see the subsidies flowing in the wrong direction, slowing down progress on climate. So I hope that's a good enough recap on that one. Hydrogen, real quick, there's there's no pit of hydrogen we can put a straw in, drill for hydrogen and get hydrogen. So it has to come from somewhere. 95% of it is coming from natural gas. 75% of that is fracked natural gas. So we're poisoning people's groundwater, a lot of it in my home state of Pennsylvania, but other parts of the country as well, by fracking for natural gas and then using that to release carbon emissions in the course of getting hydrogen, and then say, oh, now it's clean. And so in Big Island, there's a big push for hydrogen. They're partnering with Japan and a community in California to do a big hydrogen initiative when they don't even have a use for hydrogen outside of some buses that might manage to use it. They want to hitch it to Huhanua, this proposed tree burning incinerator or biomass incinerator, to basically chop down trees, then use them in some kind of process that might convert from the initial just burn for electricity to like burn for hydrogen type of scheme, just to keep this bad idea alive. It makes no sense financially, economically. Hydrogen is basically a storage mechanism. There are better batteries than using hydrogen for storage, especially when hydrogen is hard to contain. If it catches fire, the flames are invisible. Imagine a flame that you can't even see. And I mean, there are a lot of safety issues there. And it just makes no sense. Their alternatives are much better, no matter which way you look at it.
What about for aviation fuel?
The aviation fuel sector is one of the few that there's not a good non-burn solution for yet. At some point, we'll see increasingly electric planes, or maybe hydrogen planes will make sense. And then we have to find the cleanest way to make hydrogen, which will be electrolyzing water with extra wind and solar once we have enough wind and solar that we have extra. But if you don't have extra yet, there's no point in making hydrogen because you might as well use it directly and offset the fossil fuels that we're already burning. So you don't want to store things when you can just use them right away and offset stuff. So I think aviation fuel, let them keep researching and finding alternatives that even if we're still burning oil right now, is better than investing in something that's a false solution, that's just a differently bad problem until we get to a real solution. We have enough other sectors. The electricity sector can be totally cleaned up. The transportation sector in terms of ground transportation can totally be non-burn. The heating sector, which is the third main energy use sector that we have, all the buildings, all that could be non-burn as well. The industrial heating sector, which is the biggest part of the heating sector, that is more difficult, but even that it can be electrified. It does not need to be burning things. Let's solve all those things that we have solutions for already. And then the planes and boats, which are going to be one of the last sectors, even the shipping, even there's international shipping that now can work on wind. These modern types of wind things that are like these masts that like barely move, they can ship cargo around the world on wind power now. And there are some that are starting to do that. And so let's do all those things we already know how to do. And then we'll circle back around to aviation once we got the technology ready for that. Sure. All right, looks like we should get going, but thank everyone. If folks are on Zoom and yeah, let's hear.
If you don't mind. This, okay. This is actually from Dan. Dan, you mentioned substantial. How would we solve that?
Dan, you want to
And
come
how
up
do
to
you
the
do that?
So the question is, who would pay for the removal of some of the overburden of atmospheric CO2? And the way we resolved this in our petition last year, and that may well inform our answers to that question in our upcoming petitions, is that industry should pay, the oil, gas, and coal industry should pay for at least 50% of that cost for their contributions since the signing of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. So that's the way that we would have them pay a reasonable share to cover emissions arising since that time from the United States. And the rest would be, the citizens, consumers, right?
I have one more question for the folks, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, even if we were to eliminate all of the fossil fuel use, how will that then compensate? I don't know if compensate's a word, but how is that going to level out the amount of methane and dioxin from animal agriculture? As Mike was saying, there's a high amount of meat, for example, that causes diabetes, and in Hawaii is a very high level of diabetes here. So how do we?
Oh, and even further, Mike's point was that the incineration of trash or the incineration of construction materials also releases a tremendous amount of, well, a range of pollutants, as Mike was saying, including CO2. So the climate problem, not to mention the pollution problem, will not be fully resolved by phasing off of fossil fuels, but we will be, miles down the road towards preserving a more habitable climate if we were to do that. But yes, there's sources of methane, for example, other than from the burning of fossil fuels. They need to be attended to too. And that's another reason why research and development on greenhouse gas removal is necessary. Even if we were able to stop the burning of fossil fuels tomorrow, we still have a major problem because of the overburden, because of the long-lived nature, as I was saying before, of at least CO2 among the greenhouse gases. And so, we still have a lot of work to do. But as I said, I think here before, the first step, if you find yourself at the bottom of the hole, is to stop digging. Yes.
You may have answered this while I was out, I apologize. So, is there any precedent for the action you're asking EPA to take on TSCA? Similar before?
Yes, very good question. TSCA was passed by Congress in 1976. And in 1978, the United States began the phase out of CFCs. This is before the international agreement and before the amendment of the Clean Air Act. Began the phase, and CFCs are powerful ozone depleting chemicals. We began the phase out of CFCs using TSCA. And in both the draft and the final rule to phase out a number of commercial uses of CFCs in the United States, EPA identified CFCs not merely as a major ozone depleting chemical, but also as a potent climate forcing agent. So there's actually, what is that? There's a 57-year precedent, agency precedent here for the use of TSCA with respect to a powerful climate forcing agent. So, yes. Sir.
What's the role of the states?
Say it again.
What is the role of the states?
Oh, well, the states have a major role. Are you talking about with respect to resolving the climate crisis? The states have a major role. The states are in our federalist structure, laboratories of democracy. There is far-reaching climate rules, in my opinion, not going nearly far enough, but in Washington State and in California, and I know that you have done some substantial work here in Hawaii as well. Hawaii, by the way, has also attempted to take some leadership. Both Honolulu and Maui have sued some of the carbon majors for damages to compensate for your government's expenditures to address problems arising because of global warming. California just did the same last week. Rhode Island did the same a couple of years ago, and a number of cities and counties around the country. So, yeah, I think there's a major role for states and local communities. But I also want to say that when we do the citizens petitions coming up, it would be very helpful for you to get your bosses assuming you're all staff here, to yourselves as well. But we need to have a lot of individual endorsers and sponsors, and also organizational endorsers and sponsors. And just as we did last year, we will publish a separate web page listing. We'll have way too many people probably to put everybody there, but we want to have our high-level endorsers and sponsors displayed. So it would be great if, assuming you're all staff and not legislators here, if you can get your superiors to take a stand to urge the federal government to be doing more. I mean, the federal government is supposed to set strong minimum standards. It's very hard for state governments to resolve this issue on their own. And of course, you know, if we don't have strong federal standards, then we have the free rider problem, where even if Hawaii is doing something significant here, that can be essentially nullified or undone, where some other states don't pull their weight. And so I think it's vitally important that states and local governments take strong action on climate and on pollution generally. So in any event, I'll speak for Mike as well. We both appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.